The 27th argument used against the existence of God, found on the website godisimaginary.com, is entitled Think About Life After Death. And the argument basically goes like this. It begins by asking us to reflect on what life is, and it argues or proposes, it doesn't really argue for it, but it proposes that life is nothing more than a series of chemical reactions. And we've already seen that definition in this series before, that life is nothing but a series of chemical reactions. And so it asks the question, why does it make sense to think that human life, in any sense whatsoever, exceeds or continues after the death of this body? And what the argument does is tries to say that if you think about it, if you logically reflect on it, life is nothing but the chemical processes of the body. Therefore, when those chemical processes cease, life ceases as well. And so it goes on to make this argument more explicit or more clear by starting with bacteria. And by starting with bacteria, it says, is there any reason to think that bacteria, as a series of life processes, when that bacteria dies, is there any reason to think that that life continues to exist? And he comes to the conclusion, no, there's absolutely no reason to think that after the chemical processes that we call bacteria cease, that that kind of life continues. He then goes on to mosquitoes, and he asks the same question. Is the series of chemical reactions that we call mosquitoes, after it dies, is there any reason to think that it lives on? And then he goes on to ask the same question about mice, and then he gets his way to the human person again. With each of those other observations, mice, mosquitoes, and bacteria, he comes to the conclusion, and he thinks that it's self-evident that when these animals die, or these kinds of beings die, these kinds of living organisms die, that they simply cease to exist. Why is it that we think that we ourselves, the human soul, will continue to live after the death or the end of the chemical processes that we call this body? He says it's just simply silly to think that that's the case. We are nothing but chemical processes. When those cease, we stop. And he argues, or he proposes, that the reason why we think otherwise in our culture, in our society, and in many people think that we live beyond this life, the reason why that is the case is because we're just afraid, or we want to avoid our own mortality. We don't want to die, and because we don't want to die, we make up this idea that the soul exists after the death of the body. He says this is no more able to withstand careful thought than the belief in Santa Claus. We want to believe in Santa Claus because we want to think that we get a lot of presents on Christmas. Once we discover that that idea is false, then everything else related to it tumbles as well. Therefore, the conclusion is that this belief that there is a human soul that survives the death of the body is no more convincing or no more allowable from a rational, scientific, reflective standpoint than the belief in Santa Claus. In response to this, I would make several observations. First of all, I find it somewhat frustrating that the author so simplistically says that life is nothing more than a series of chemical reactions. The reason why I say that is not just because of our philosophical and theological differences in our belief systems, but because from the time that I was a young man, I remember when I was in high school, one of the vivid memories that I have is opening up our biology book and looking at the definition of life, which typically high school or college texts in biology will begin with a chapter defining the subject. What is biology? Well, biology is the study of life, and then we'll go on to try to explain or define what is meant by life. And I remember when I was in high school, and that's been well over 20 years ago now, that I took biology in high school. When I took biology in high school, the definition in the book was an evasive one. It started out by saying, it's a great mystery about what life is. But basically we define life based on certain functions, and it would go on to describe what those functions are. That it's a self-sustaining type of system that's usually characterized by the ability to reproduce itself and to take in energy from the outside into that system and to replicate its own cells and so on. And so we go into a series of observations, usually 6, 7, 8 points about what characterizes life. But it's primarily descriptive rather than defining what life itself is. We all know the difference by looking at it. We can look at one type of thing, like a rock for instance, and then we look at something like a snake or an insect or a human being or a dog or a cat or whatever. We look at these various different types of living systems and we intuitively know that there's something fundamentally different between a rock or dirt or or whatever, and these types of living organisms, that be a tree or grass or human beings or whatever, all of these things live, and so there's some type of principle, there's some type of reality that is there that is not present, apparently, in the other kinds of things, what we might call the inanimate sorts of things. And since then, since my experience of taking biology in high school, where the definition of life was something of a mystery, I've made it a habit of sorts to look at various texts on biology and to see what people say about what biology is. I looked at an advanced placement biology textbook here a while back, and it did the same thing that my textbook did when I was in high school. It admitted that we can't really define what life is, but we can talk about certain properties or attributes that life tends to have. Not necessarily always, but these are ones that are frequently present there. If you take the time to look up on the internet, just look up, what does biology say life is, or how does biology define life? You will find exactly what I'm talking about. You'll find that it's an ongoing controversy, that there are ongoing disagreements about what exactly life is. You could take a summative, a non-authoritative source, like the Wikipedia article on biology, the definition of life in biology or whatever, and you'll find in there the same thing, that there are ongoing disputes about exactly what life is. As I was just looking around for 5 or 10 minutes earlier today, thinking about this particular argument, I found another argument or another scholarly paper that was written on this subject that compared sort of a philosophical definition of life with a biological one, and it talked about the possibilities of bridging between those two disciplines a definition of life, and it was making the case that these definitions are not necessarily contradictory, that they are mutually sort of illuminating, that they shed some light one upon the other. But the main point here, without getting into the finer details of the argument, the main point here is that it's frustrating to see someone so flippantly and so casually define what life is, not acknowledging that there's an ongoing struggle to try to put our finger on the deep mystery that is present there with life. There's something more than just a chemical reaction. When you go into a laboratory and you see a chemical reaction, we don't automatically draw the conclusion that it's life. Life has other principles and other attributes and other characteristics that makes it very, very mysterious. Now, going on to the other question of, not only what is life, but also why do we think that human life, or how can a person seriously think that human life has any existence beyond this life? I think part of the response to this is to think a little bit more clearly about why it is we think human life has this endurance, and why it is different in various ways from other kinds of life. It's a fair question to ask what happens to bacteria life or a mouse or some other kind of thing in contrast to what happens to a human being. If we look at the history of philosophy, we'll find that there's a very lengthy and interesting arguments going on and have been going on and continue to go on about this very subject among very learned and very knowledgeable human beings, trying to figure out what this difference is. Within the argument itself here, within the argument that's made here, the author recognizes that human beings, unlike the other animals, want to avoid mortality, that we have this fear of mortality. I could formulate that a little more positively and say that human beings have this desire to live forever. We have this desire to live beyond the constraints of this limited biological way of life that we have here and now. That's one thing that would differentiate us from the other animals. Bacteria, so far as I can tell, I have no evidence that bacteria or mice or snakes or lizards or dogs or cats even for that matter, I have no evidence that they sit around and think about these kinds of questions that we're talking about now. That perhaps suggests that the human spirit has a longing to live in a way that the other animals do not, that it has a longing to survive, that it has a desire, and it senses a purpose, that our existence and our life has a meaning beyond this one. And perhaps that interior longing itself is a clue that our way of life or our life means something different than the other kinds of life do. We could talk for a long time about Plato's arguments for the immortality of the soul. We could talk about Aristotle's understanding of the human soul, which there's some debate about that. We could talk about Thomas Aquinas' arguments, philosophical arguments. when you try to analyze and look at the arguments and understandings regarding the human soul, you'll find that they typically fall into one of several different categories, philosophical categories. One is a kind of mechanistic, sort of naturalistic understanding of the human soul, that is nothing but physical processes. Another approach is what was called vitalism, and that is that life is a different kind of principle from the material process. That's almost like something infused into the material machine that causes it to live, but it's a very different kind of principle. You have within what's called Aristotelianism, or Aristotle's thought, which was picked up and developed by people like Thomas Aquinas and others in the Middle Ages, and continues to be defended by various people in our contemporary setting now. In Aristotelian philosophy, you have an understanding of the material aspect of living organisms, but there's also an understanding of what is called form. Form is this kind of infusing, or this informing principle in material things. It's like an interior structure, almost like what we call, not really, but it's almost like what we talk about as DNA. That DNA is this kind of information system, a replicating system that continues to direct and inform an organism by infusing it with information and directive information and coding that causes the cell to operate or to replicate in certain ways, or the trillion cells in the human body to replicate in certain ways. The form of Aristotle is not the same thing as DNA, but it bears some interesting similarities to it. The form is this kind of almost organizing principle in things. It's what organizes the matter. It's what causes the matter to have these attributes rather than another set of attributes or characteristics. The reason why I bring that up here is because I think that is valuable to getting into Aristotle and Aquinas' and others' understanding of the human soul. And again, when I refer to Aristotle and Aquinas, I'm only referring to especially noteworthy persons in this long tradition. There continue to be many contemporary persons who take some similar model of understanding the human soul as what I'm trying to quickly describe here. Now, the way they would describe the difference between a soul, say the human soul versus an animal soul versus a vegetative soul, they would call it. These are just different names that we give to life principles. The life principle of, let's say, the grass outside, or the life principle of the tree, is a life principle that is totally submerged in the material processes that are going on, so that when those material processes cease, that soul or that life principle also ceases to exist. It has nothing to do beyond the material activities of that particular organism. The same thing is true, apparently, with all the other sorts of animal life. Animals, lower than human persons, human beings, animals also are a series of living processes, so that when the matter of that living system is no longer able to sustain the form, or that informing principle, or that principle of life in the thing, the life principle ceases to exist because it has no function beyond the activities of the material body. When it comes to the human person, we're talking about a reality that is more ambiguous, that is more difficult to understand in these terms. Because the human soul, in fact, or the human life principle, does in fact sustain the body. It does cause the body to live and function the way that it does in this world. But also the human soul seems to have certain functions that rise above matter and its processes. For example, the thought, the work of the intellect. The intellect is able to make of the brain and the body an object of reflection and study. I can think about my brain. I can think about my body. That implies a kind of hovering over the body. Another thing that many neuroscientists and people who study the mind and the brain talk about is a kind of causal interaction that takes place between the brain and the mind being our sort of conscious awareness of ourselves and of the activities of our body, the brain being the physical organ that is related to this conscious process. The brain obviously has some type of causal influence on the mind, because if your brain is damaged, or if you take drugs or whatever, it affects your mental states. However, at the same time, your mind can affect your body. And so there's a kind of top-down causal influence as well as a bottom-up causal influence. So there seems to be, like when the mind, right now I'm directing my body to say certain things, I'm thinking certain things, I'm reflecting on what I'm saying, I can direct my body to do certain things. And I can, through disciplining the mind and through forceful effort, I can even change the body and its states. I can choose to, over a period of time, I can even change the very physical structure of the brain itself. There have been remarkable studies done of how the brain itself changes over time with volitional choices, free choices made by the person, or deliberate choices over time affect the sort of connections within the brain itself. And so there is very strong evidence that there's a top-down kind of causal impact.